afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. This is Jeff Martin with Let's Talk About It. My podcast is going through a lot of transitions right now. I'm moving everything over to Substack because it's free. Eventually, we will be doing that here on Streamline as well. No longer broadcasting live on Facebook. They made it a little more difficult to do that, so I don't mind. I'll just kill the Rumble and YouTube, and I think I'm on X somewhere, and obviously everything's going to be on Substack. So I haven't had my guest, my good friend Dr. Dinah Dye, on since I got back from Israel. We really haven't talked much about the trip, and of course, with everything going on. So I couldn't wait to have her back on. Plus, she's writing a new book. I got a couple of her chapters here. I reviewed them. So hey, welcome my good friend Dr. Dinah Dye to the podcast. Hi, Dinah.
Hi, Jeff. How are you doing?
I'm doing good.
All right. So
I'm somewhat
kind of a
excited.
wild day, right? Post-bombing. We're
What's
dating.
funny about the bombing thing was Donald Trump. I mean, there's a couple of things I'm just going to mention about that real quick. The whole thing with Elon Musk, I thought was a hubbub. I thought it was all fictitious. When he said, I'm giving them 2 weeks, within 2 weeks, I went, nah, he doesn't broadcast like that. I don't think that's true. I think he's going to do something sooner or nothing at all. I actually thought he was going to do something. 2 days later, he did. So I'm like, okay. And I mean, nobody wants to see war. Nobody wants to see death. Nobody wants to see any of this happening in the world. But I mean, let's face it. Our country, the United States of America, has been getting slammed by Iran for 46 years. We've lost a lot of people. And finally, we have a president, in my opinion, who's addressing that issue. So I hate war, but I like Donald Trump. So
It's very conflicting. And honestly, we wouldn't be here if it weren't for Obama and his, pallets of cash and all the other stuff that some of these Democrat presidents have done, going back to Clinton. Mm-hmm. It's the typical situation where, drip by drip by drip. And then pretty soon, you've just filled a stadium full of water and you're boxed into a corner and there's nothing you can do. I mean, this could have been dealt with decades ago and never was. So, and I like I said, I remain conflicted. I'm like you, the U.S. does not need to be involved in a war overseas. I think Israel should finish the job that they started. I don't know the dynamic between Netanyahu and Trump. It looks like they're pretty buddy-buddy, and this thing was in the planning stages for months, But I worry because I know there's a lot of bluster and blathering from Iran right now, saber rattling. But I worry about Israel because they have the capability to take her off the map. I'm worried about cyber attack, taking down the whole grid of the United States. I'm worried about sleeper cells. Thank you, Joe Biden. Lord knows how many there are and where they are. So that sort of kept me up. I was impressed beyond measure with what our military is able to do, because I was sort of in the camp like we don't even have a military, like they're barely functional. If we got in a war with China, it'd be, we don't even have enough ammo for a day. And I was kind of in that camp. So that was an impressive, that was just impressive to watch what they accomplished in those, all those planes and pilots and, but I'm not settled in my spirit at all. And I'm not having a party and celebrating the bombing.
Right.
So now we kind of wait and hold our breath and pray to the Lord somehow, some way, Iran would come to the negotiating table. I don't know how it's possible. They're crazy. They can't be trusted. They lie. Who are we dealing with here? But I guess that's where we are.
Well, I've been writing about Iran since my Navy days. I was in the military when the Iranian Revolution occurred. We were actually in the Persian Gulf because they took a bunch of
It was on my birthday that happened.
Oh, really?
I always remember it, November 4th, 1979.
Well, what strikes me, Israel's had missiles raining down on her population for decades and surrounded by hostile nations. When I was in Israel, and I was in Israel from May 4th to the 15th, there was one point where I was sitting near the hotel. It was like a food court. We hadn't really, I don't think we had gone up to the wall, the Wailing Wall yet, but I was sitting there having lunch. And there was just a parade of kids, small children, like on a school bus tour or something like that. Several groups went by me, and I was looking at these ethnically mixed Israelis, Arab, Ethiopian. I remember one little pudgy kid. He was bright red hair, freckles all day long. And I was sitting there thinking, look at these beautiful children. I mean, they were so pretty. And I thinking they have to grow up with the thought of missiles raining down on them, rockets landing in their neighborhoods. They have to live with this. And I thought, this is sad. So to me, the whole thing is sad. Of course, we're biblical people, so we kind of understand it from a different lens. But I remember sitting there seeing the beautiful dark hair, the long eyelashes, and these beautiful children that are growing up in this insanity. And they're like the third generation. And I was like,
Right.
It was really hard to take. But anyway, having said all of that, Israel was amazing. Lost my passport the first night I was there.
I know. I guess you got that sorted out because you're home.
Well, you know what happened is, oh boy, the bus tour, the guy who leading the tour, his hair was on fire. He's like, oh my God, you're going to be here for a month. I hope you can plan on staying here. I hope you got a lot of money because you're not going to get your passport for at least a month, month and a half. And that's going to be an emergency passport. And he's like, he was so erratic about it. I was like, I finally had to shut him off.
Yeah.
And just do what needed to be done. The next day I went over to the embassy. I was there for 2 hours, got emergency passport. In fact, Dina, it's funny because I knew where they were going to meet. It was going to be an hour away from where I was in Tel Aviv. And so I went back to the hotel, got a cab, and the cab driver took me there. I was waiting for them for 20 minutes to show up. So when he showed up, he gets off the bus and he goes, I'm witnessing a miracle. I'm actually witnessing a miracle. But the truth of the matter was there was no tourists. Therefore, they could process me through the embassy rather quickly.
Yeah.
And there was an American girl who Ali out there with her husband. She said, I'll get you taken care of. She said, you got about 30 minutes? And I was like, I absolutely do. And so I walked out of the emergency passport. Let me tell you, I kept my passport next to me. It was a fabulous trip. I was grateful to be there, met some really great people. But I got to see what I've been studying for, the last couple of decades. I got to actually be a part of the story that I've been researching and learning about, and certainly with your help and all the things that you've helped me to understand differently. I saw it all. So a lot of what I was doing there was somewhat familiar to me, but I actually got to be there. So it was.
Well, there's nothing like it.
There's nothing. It's
great. You create this imagery in your brain, right? For years, you sort of plan, but you have no idea till you step off that airplane and begin to walk through the land. Every rock and stone, it's got significance, and it's just breathtaking when you're finally there and you see it. It's a true spiritual experience.
We went to one place, and I'll finish with that part of this podcast. There was a farmer that they told the story of a farmer who started digging on his land, and he hit a solid object. And no matter where he went, he would hit the solid object. Well, where we happened to be was what they excavated, which was he was on top of a 4-story building. And as you leaned over and looked down to what they'd excavated, here's a 4-story building buried. And it was common for the Roman armies and conquering armies to bury and build on top. And so here you're looking down at 4-story building. The guy had no idea. And of course, now he can't plant the land.
Yeah. That is the hazard of owning property in Israel. Yeah.
Well, those kinds of things are common. It was amazing to me. Amazing. Go ahead.
What's so unique about it is you just keep going back to Israel over and over again, and you can see new things. Like, I
Right.
don't know too many places like that. You got the ruins, you go see them, and that's kind of, oh, that's nice. But every trip back is something's been uncovered, new ruins somewhere. Something confirming the biblical story over and over again. It's just it's a well that never runs dry. Visits to Israel.
It was really like the biblical story because that too never stops
Right.
revealing information. So it was just all in all fascinating. I've been to Greece and Turkey and now Israel. And what's ironic to me is, by the grace of God, we get there before all of this happened.
Amen, brother. Are you
Every
not there during it?
Well,
Now
everybody
you
was
can't
like,
even get
"Why?"
out or in.
I know, and everybody's saying to me, "Why are you going to Israel? There's a war going on over there." When we were there was no sign of war. You know, when I was in Tel
Right.
Aviv, I felt like I was in Seattle because the same kind of culture exists. But anyway, the highlight of the trip for me was on the Sea of Galilee. That's when the spiritual thing kicked in. And I remember literally with my arms wide open, just crying, sitting on the boat because it was almost like I was being connected to the place of his presence, if you will. And you'll understand that better than most. Anyway, that was my trip to Israel. Now there's chaos and buildings being destroyed. And it's really kind of sad.
Well, my first trip was right after the Yom Kippur War, 1973. Let's just talk chaos and instability. And had a friend who was on a kibbutz in the Golan Heights, as you can imagine.
Wow.
So it kind of, doesn't really matter when you go. There's something going on.
Well, Dina, what's been going on with you? Let's jump into why we got you on today. What have you been up
Well,
to?
I've been really busy writing a book, and that's extremely time consuming. I spend many an hour through the day. Of course, I have to get up in the middle, take a walk, clear my head. But I'm just on the last chapter. It's called The Greatest Exodus, and the subtitle is A Divine Warrior Tradition. And it's actually going really well, way quicker than I expected. I have used AI to help me organize my notes. I will be totally transparent on that, which cut my time in half because half the time was just trying to organize all my research that I'd done into some sort of coherent, way to approach the material. So that really helped a lot. So anyways, I'm on chapter 8. I'm just trying to figure out now how to tie up the whole story. This is the last chapter, as I said. And it's really been quite a journey. I wasn't expecting it to be quite this much of a journey. It's been a journey for me in my personal walk and my relationship with God and how I understand Yahweh and how I see Yeshua. And so when I was starting to write my book on, basically on the Exodus and looking for how the New Testament connected to the Exodus, because there are myriads of scriptures and themes and motifs, etc., from the New Testament, back to the greatest story told, in the Bible. And at the same time, the Bible Project came out with a whole series on the Exodus. And I'm like, oh, really? Like, how frustrating is that? What am I? So I started listening to their, the podcast, see where they were going, what they were doing. I was like, they were covering all the stuff I was going to cover. So I just thought, I'm not going to repeat everything they just said. It's going to sound like I stole all their material. So I had to go back to the drawing board, and I just left it for a couple of weeks. It's kind of like, Lord, I don't, what do I do? I felt this is a topic I needed to write about, and I needed to write about it now, but I had, I was frustrated. So, and it's not like it's, the material is copyrighted and belongs to somebody, right? But
Right.
I went back through my books and I started looking at my workbook, and I thought, well, how can I massage this and sort of work it into, and I realized that theme of that I've talked about quite a bit, of the divine warrior and combat myth, et cetera, that's very much a part of the ancient Near East world. I wonder if I can figure out a way to incorporate that and have that be the lens through how I would write, because so much of the Exodus story, all the elements of the combat myth, of the ancient Near East combat myth, are all in the Exodus story. And you know, as you go through it, you can just see it. So I kind of laid it all out, and I had 8 steps, and I was sort of working through those. And then I realized it just sort of fit through everything. And I just began to look at the Exodus story from that lens. So it's kind of the combat. I don't want to go into the whole thing, but the overriding view, this idea of the combat myth, which just means in the ancient world, you had what they call the chaos creature, the chaos figure would rise up, cause chaos, imagine. And then a warrior, divine warrior would come in, they do battle. The divine warrior would defeat chaos. The divine warrior would be victorious. And because he was victorious, certain things went along with that, like building a temple. Then there would be a great proclamation, or the herald would go forth and tell the good news that the divine warrior had defeated chaos and the empire was at rest, kind of thing. There would be processions by the people. It's great, you know, acclamation and paying homage and, you know, cheering and shouting, Hosanna, you know, whatever. And then it would end sort of with an enthronement ritual, which was be accompanied by a covenant meal of some kind. So those are the sort of steps. And again, all those steps are in the Exodus story. And then I'm going, okay, now when I get into the New Testament, I found all the same kind of steps. I put them in the same order. I explained them in the same way. But now I'm taking it up a notch from the Exodus to the, and people will call it the greater Exodus, but I'm calling it the greatest Exodus, you know.
Right.
And finally, I mean, the book of Revelation just seals the deal as this great divine warrior comes and delivers and rescues his people, you know, ultimately from sin and death and enslavement and empire and all these different things. It all fit in rather nicely. So I made it to chapter 8 to where I can pull the whole thing together. But I think it works. I'm hoping.
Well,
I mean, it does in my mind.
You sent me 3 chapters. I've got through the second chapter, and you mentioned Star Wars, and I think it was the
Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
And I was like, you know, I remember when I read the Book of Mormon, and we're talking about Moroni, who was the figure who resolved everything, the man of war, and I was able to look at that because we talked briefly about, you know, this chaos and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's fluid in your other books, but you can't watch an action movie today where you don't have a bad guy and then a good guy, and the good guy usually saves the day. And I'm going, this is like historical in just about every culture.
Yeah.
This whole ideal. And I thought about the Satan being, you know, and Tiamat and the story of the Babylonian. Mm-hmm. All of these things, I'm going, this is a fluid conversation in every culture and every society.
Yep.
Good versus evil. And eventually good saves the day.
Yep.
That's what I was reading when I was reading your book. And I was thinking too, you know, if I think about Mark Biltz for a minute, who was always looking at words and what they meant and how they played a role in the story, and going back and learning the actual meaning of it. And I'm reading your new book, and I've read your other 3 books, and I'm going, yes, but that doesn't address the cultural reality that those people were living in. It's just talking about the author and how they wrote. But most people, when they're reading the Bible, it's not in their mind to wonder what the culture was like, what the real lives of these people. And your writings, even in the ones you sent me, they always address that. Because, and I'm agreeing with you, if you don't understand the way the world worked when they were writing their articles or their letters or their, I call it Talmudic writing for lack of a better sense, it was all Jewish, then you miss a great big chunk. We can't help but superimpose our reality on the text. Well, the problem with doing that is we got 960 interpretations of the New Testament, and none of them address the Exodus story.
I know. And
which is
it's
what
everywhere. I mean,
think.
the entirety of the book of Revelation is filled with Exodus imagery, from the plagues to the wilderness to the lamb that was slain at Passover. It's just all through there. And it is unfortunate. Somebody asked me, is this a Christian book? On my Facebook page. I said, well, the goal of the book is to help Christians understand their Exodus heritage and to help the Messianics understand their Yeshua heritage. And so I put both of them together, and I hope it serves its purpose. I have no idea how this is going to go. I mean, I tried to write it much less academic than my first three books, in more of a sort of conversational style, although
That way. I like how you started out by talking about your family and your
yeah,
childhood, things of that nature. You more
hopefully that'll
personalized.
draw people in. But some of the material, I mean, it's heavy stuff. It's not things that people think about, but I'm trying very hard to connect them all together for people, because I like to read the Bible as a sort of large picture, an overview from beginning to end, and not get bogged down into specific details. And I'm hoping that people will see that in this story. Now, the divine warrior theme isn't something that's well known, and some people might find it kind of weird, I guess. What's interesting to me is apocalyptic literature. So the divine warrior combat myth thing is very old, thousands of years, going back to ancient Mesopotamia. And like you said, in virtually every culture had it. And then over time, when we're coming into the New Testament, I guess the apocalyptic literature kind of hijacks, I guess might not be a great word, hijacks the combat myth. So they kind of merge, and then the apocalyptic literature tends to be, very dreamlike, visionary, but sort of more focused eschatologically on this final end of things when everything is all restored. But there's a real marriage between the two. And if you don't really understand the combat myth in the beginning, it's kind of hard to understand where is apocalyptic literature getting all of these ideas that it has. And it's very symbolic, right? And how it presents these great wars, and these battles. But it really got it from the combat myth motif that's very ancient. So I tried to show that as well. This is a thread that is from beginning to end. Hopefully I did a good job. I guess I'll find out.
When I think about your first three books, I think about how you tailored that story, and I'm just going to pop these up on the screen. In the temple revealed in creation, the chaos myth and that all that stuff is there when we see chapter 3 begin. And then all of a sudden, Adam and Eve are no longer in the land. They're chased out of the land, and something else is kind of taken over. And the story's starting to roll through the centuries with Adam. And then in your temple revealed in the garden, you kind of bring that together with new creation and recreation. And all of a sudden, we've got Noah, and he's not dealing with a lot of chaos in the form of an invading army. He's kind of setting the stage for the birth of Israel. And I go, when people look at the Bible from that perspective and they see the storyline, then it becomes a lot easier to see that the storyline is about this people that God created in order to bring this story to life through the centuries. And it's always, and then when you get to the New Testament through the Hellenistic age, where everybody's got a God, then you get into the Satan chaos being. And I'm going, my God, this is so, it follows the theme of having to fight in order to be free from something, whether it's politics or government, which I think you do a very good job of doing that. As I read your book, it's all familiar language to me, but I see the personal side of you in your writing this time, as opposed to the academic, because let's face it, the temple revealed in creation was a difficult book to read. I had to learn how to be academic.
Yeah. Well, I don't cite, so I don't have citations, footnotes, or anything in this book. Now, from time to time, I might quote a scholar, but it's barely a sentence, and I just try to insert it in there so it's seamless. And I'm not even going to do like a bibliography, a formal bibliography at the end of the book. I'll probably just have a resource page. These are all the resources that I used for writing, but I didn't want to sort of interrupt the story with putting in footnotes and citations, and and somebody who really wanted to look would have to stop and go look it up. I wanted it to just flow. And so that alone is very different from the first three books. And
Right.
and again, I tried to make it a little more conversational.
Well, I think it is. What I've read, I didn't get to chapter 3 yet, but what I read, it was more of, in fact, I had a question to ask you, and we're going to kind of pivot back to that question. It was more about you.
Well,
So,
the first section,
yeah, the
I mean,
first
chapter
section was,
2 is not about me.
but I know, but that's not what I'm trying to say. The book, it wasn't more of a researched material that I
More
was reading.
personal. Yeah.
Yes. So I wanted to ask you this question. When you came across Yeshua, we talked about this in the late 70s or whenever it was. And that, I remember you saying something to me when you read the New Testament. You went, "Oh my God, this is Jewish." And I wanted to ask you to circle back to that time in your life when that happened to you, and you got, "Oh my God, this is the God that I believe in." Then you started learning. I mean, what happened to you when that happened, and how did all of this resonate with your family members and the way your world was all those years ago? Because you spent the past 40 plus years in the Christian world
Yep.
bringing this to life.
Yeah.
And I wanted to hear you tell me a little bit about how that was and why the Christian world.
Well, I think in the beginning, my faith in Yeshua had more to do with, emotional healing than it did with knowledge, information, wisdom, any of that. Because I had my fair share of baggage, like many. And having gone, been in the new age for years and all kinds of weird stuff, let's say, things I've never even told my kids, I realized there was some healing that was needed. And I read the Bible cover to cover in a week. Yeah, who does that? But I got to the story of the woman caught in the act of adultery. And for me, that was like my moment when I realized there was something different, unique about Yeshua that I had not come across in any of the other, quote, religions and New Age craziness that I had been involved with. And so that's where the healing began. And the first sort of response to that was to sort of ask forgiveness to most of my family. And one of the first things I did was write a letter of asking my grandfather for forgiveness for just being such a reprobate granddaughter. And my parents, I just, was just selfish and all that sort of thing. So it began in the place I think it begins for a lot of people, that sort of that healing and that ability to sort of go forward because you feel like you're in shoes of cement and you have not been able to move. But once I transitioned out of that, then it was got cerebral for me. So I went from emotional to cerebral, which is always where I kind of my lane. And then I began to really ingest the New Testament, and it just blew my mind how Jewish it was. I had no idea. I had no idea what I was reading. And, when I was a kid, I had some friends who took me to a Catholic church, and I thought it was kind of interesting. They take me on, Christmas Eve. It's like, I don't really know what's going on. I remember in school when religion was in school, I learned the Lord's Prayer. So there, bits and pieces had been planted in me, but now it was like, it's a go. You can start to see this, and you actually kind of know the Lord's Prayer. How I didn't know, but so now the journey begins, and I just find myself completely in an environment of non-Jews. It didn't matter where I went or where I turned. That was the environment I was in. And so I don't know exactly when. I remember going to a Jews for Jesus conference back in the 70s. I think it was in Mount Hermon in California, because I had this sense I needed to be around a bunch of Jews to kind of figure out what just happened. And that was, the earlier founders of Jews for Jesus and stuff. That was really kind of eye-opening and revolutionary to me. And it helped me kind of synthesize these two worlds somewhat. But I didn't end up amongst Jewish people. It didn't matter what I did or where I went, where I worshiped, what community I was in. It was always Gentiles and me. So I sort of had the Paul experience, although I would be the last to proclaim any closeness to Paul. I don't look remotely like Paul. But I felt that was the call on my life. So at the same time, my closest friend in the world, Jane Bakewell, we actually met during the Guatemalan earthquake in 1974. She had kind of embraced this initially. She had met several people in our area who were Jewish. And so she kind of came through it that way. Her ministry ended up being to Jews. So she's the Gentile. God sends her. She goes to Israel and she studies under Dr. Michael Brown and various other ones. And she ends up at Beth Messiah in Maryland with Paul Wilbur and all those guys. Me, I end up, in northern New Mexico with a bunch of Gentiles. So we laugh about it to this day, but God sent the Jew to the Gentiles, and he sent my Gentile friend to the Jews. And it's always been the case.
I have a question. You mentioned, being that incorrigible kid, you had to write a letter to your grandfather. And then all of a sudden you had this experience, and now you're talking about Jesus to the same Jewish family.
Yeah.
How did that go?
Well, my grandfather, it wasn't very long before he died. I feel like he was like 95 or something. And we had a conversation. His name was Jeremiah, right? And he was an Orthodox Jew. I mean, he went to synagogue religiously every Shabbat. He walked, sat in the front row, loved Yahweh with all his heart, knew the Siddur. And we sat and had a conversation. I was explaining to him what I believed. And I was explaining it to him from a Jewish person and a Jewish perspective about a Jewish man named Yeshua the Messiah. And at the end of that conversation, he looked at me and he said, "You and I," he goes, "we believe the same thing." Now, I still to this day, I'm not 100% sure I know what he meant, but apparently we meant the same thing. So I don't know. I can't say that he knew Yeshua, but he understood what I was saying, and it touched him, and he knew we were on the same page. Now, the rest of my family is not as religious by any stretch as my grandfather was. My parents we were raised conservative Jews, kind of on the margins. They had a period where they went to, to synagogue on Shabbat, but then that stopped, and we would go for the high holidays, for sure, Passover, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, of course. And I think what ministered to them is the fact that I asked them to forgive me for being such a jerk. So that told them that all the weird religions and everything that I had been through, this one was different. So they kind of put aside their preconceived ideas of what it meant. I don't think they even knew, quote unquote, that I was a Christian per se. That wasn't part of the vernacular. The challenge came with my uncle. Now, my uncle at one point was the president of the synagogue in Ottawa. And so this was not going well. And then I was going to be marrying a Gentile, which wasn't going well at all. And so at that point, they refused to come to my wedding and all that. They did finally get over all that, because several of his children married Gentiles. So they really couldn't hold it against me anymore. But initially that was difficult, and what made it easier is that I lived in New Mexico and they lived in Canada. So we were, 3,500 miles apart. And I could walk out my faith and not bring shame on my parents, because the Jewish community in Ottawa is quite small. And so if anybody knew that I believed in Yeshua or Jesus, it would have been very difficult for my parents. So they didn't have to deal with that because I didn't live anywhere near, and nobody knew what I was doing or what my lifestyle was like. And then over time, my parents just totally accepted. I mean, it was just a non-issue because I was a different person. That's how they knew my character was different than what it had been. And then jump ahead, writing books. My mother read all my books. I can't imagine she understood a thing I said, but she loved them, and she put them in the library of the retirement residence that she lives in for other people to read who probably don't understand a thing I said. But, it's fine with my family now. And my sister, she didn't have the advantages that I had. I went to Hebrew school, and in the early years, my parents did go to synagogue. She had none of it. Like, she has no frame of reference at all. Zero, nada. But I'll tell you, when something happens in the family, I'm the first one to call for prayer. And I did take her to a conference that I did up in north of Toronto. It was a Shavuot conference. I flew out there for that, and I dragged her up there. I can't imagine she understood any of it, but she faithfully was there. She worked my book table, and I'm sure she heard something, but still doesn't really have a concept of, Yeshua and him in her life at all. So it's kind of a mixed bag, I guess.
Well, now, thank you, because I remember when I was reading, actually, when you sent this to me, I started thinking, what was it like for her to start talking about New Testament? So I think you've explained that pretty well for me. Now, you've spent 40 years plus in the churches, dealing with Christians, and then eventually in the Messianic route, and then the Hebrew roots. And I've always thought, I was listening to someone recently, I can't remember who it was, and they were offended by all of the Christians who were now mimicking first century Jews. It was somebody in Israel. And I understood it. I absolutely understood it. But you've been in the Christian arena as a Jewish woman, trying to do what? I mean, what was it that you were studying and researching and then sharing and teaching? What was the goal behind all of that? I'm sure there was some transitional periods in your life about all this, but it was still within the Christian community.
Oh yeah.
What was in your head to walk into a church and say, hey, I'm a Jewish girl, let me tell you about Yeshua?
Yeah. I just wanted them to see that the New Testament was Jewish, with a Jewish Messiah written by Jewish men, mostly, and that everything in it had a connection to something, either in the Torah, the prophets, the writings, whatever. And that it was a seamless story, and it was a story about Israel, and that Yeshua personified Israel. He walked as though he was Israel. I mean, he was himself, but he was Israel. And all the stories just connect into one story. It's not like this happened over here, this is Abraham, and that all went down, and oh, that's nice. And now we're over here with Moses, like these sort of separate episodes that have nothing one with the other. And it was always my heart, okay, let's look at it from this lens. But I did realize rather early, because I had the blessing of being immersed in a Jewish culture. And so when you are, that's the lens through which you could see. And I was frustrated because they couldn't see it. And I didn't understand why they couldn't see it. It's like, it's so obvious. Why can't you see this? So it took me a little while, and I had to get over my impatience to try to figure out a way to show them the big story, how they were part of it, and how they were part of it, and the reason they were part of it. And that, technically speaking, the Bible doesn't start out with a Jewish Adam and Eve. The
Right.
Bible starts out with humanity, and then God chose this people to work through to restore humanity. And so he's now restored you. But he used the culture and context of the Jewish people over, millennia to show that story. So I just kept at it and at it. I was kicked out of more churches. I was labeled a heretic. I can't even, I mean, I'm still labeled a heretic. I can't figure that out. It doesn't matter if I'm the Messianic, the Hebrew roots, or the Christian. Somehow I don't fit.
Well, I'm going to address that because my passion for years, when this thing all hit me, it was kind of like first the anger. I got mad because nobody was teaching any of this. And then I had to get over myself with that stuff. And then I was thinking, my God, my Christian brothers and sisters are missing I used to say 98% of the biblical story because of the 2% that has literally promulgated the last 2,000 years of what we've learned in all the denominations. And I thought, the Bible is not discussing any of that. And I wanted so bad for the Christian mind to go, wow. And of course, talking to various people over the years, when they got it, and they went, wow. But that's a hard thing to do, to get the Christian mind to say, let me go back and look at what it was like for the kings of Israel and the culture that they were living in. And then to try to understand that what we're reading about them was written by somebody else century or two later, or 500 years later. And you have to kind of piece all this together and realize that Moses didn't sit on a rock and then have everything in the first 5 books copied and sent through the history.
Copy and paste. Yeah.
Yeah. Copy and paste. He didn't do that. And so when you start realizing that some of these books are written, 200, 300 years after the fact by people who are telling a story from a cultural vein that didn't exist with the person they're talking about. And you go, there's so much more to be learned from this. And so my thing was, I just want the Christian to see that it's not just a bunch of scripture proof texting and a denominational understanding of the Bible. And that's like damn near impossible to do in a culture that has been told this is the way it is.
Yeah.
And then you go to the next denomination and this is the way it is. And this is the way it is. And this is the way it is. And none of them have a Jewish footprint. It's just difficult. Now, so you started writing books.
Yeah. I mean, that the first book I wrote in 2016. So, not all that long ago, 9 years ago. Up until then, I just had binders full of research until I finally decided what I wanted to write about. I think when I did understand the significance of the temple and seeing the original pattern of the cosmic temple in the beginning, Genesis 1 pattern, that was revolutionary through various scholars that I was reading. And I determined I would kind of be a bridge between the scholarly world and, the folks. Although I probably tended to err a little bit more on the scholarly side than the folk side, but I'm working at it. But that was a paradigm shift to understand the temple in that way, and that's what finally solidified things for me. All the research that I had done for 40 plus years fit in that box, if you will. And so then I thought, well, when I started out, I thought this book on the temple is going to be 1,000 pages and nobody in their right mind is going to read it. So we got Houston, we got a problem. So I decided to take, the chunks, creation, the garden, and Noah's Ark. I was going to keep going, but I realized if you had Genesis 1 through 11, you pretty much had everything. If you understood the pattern of those chapters, you had the foundation of everything you needed to understand everything else. Now, obviously, other things came to bear, but the basics would be there. So I left it at that. And then, COVID hit and I lost my mind like everybody else. And it's taken me a while just for my brain to sort of adjust and be ready to write another book. But I was determined that I felt people really needed to understand the Exodus story in a way, because the Exodus story filters through everything. I mean, it's all through the prophets. It's all through the writings. It's all through the New Testament. It's everywhere. And not to recognize it, if you don't know the story well, you won't recognize those features when you come to other parts of Scripture. So I thought, well, this is time to really get this story down pat so people can understand it, and then we can bring in, the other parts of the Bible and help them see it. So I've just rested in the fact, this is my lot. Not everybody gets it. I do have a lot of support, so I thank all the folks that bought my books and appreciate the work I've done. But I'm never going to be, quote, a success, in the eyes of the church or in the eyes of the Messianic world, because I don't fit in either.
Well, now you're talking my language, because I don't fit in a variety of groups either, including my own. But I was thinking while you were just talking there about the Darby books and talking about the rapture and how that was all born in the 1800s, and then Scofield wrote a whole denominational book surrounded by that.
Right.
But where they were misguided in that thinking is they were really talking about an Exodus story. They just had to put it in one day God's going to come and take all the Christians who have persecuted the Jews for the last 2,000 years up and away. And I went, it's kind of hard, because that's also entrenched in the New Testament theology, but it's still talking about an Exodus.
Right.
And I think that they went to the extreme end of that to support the church. It's kind of funny, because when I'm talking to Christians, in particular Christians who have, who've studied, Christianity has to be inserted in the story. And I'm thinking, well, why don't we just remove it long enough to see what the real story was, so we could find out where our story began, because it was Jewish.
Yeah.
That's not in the mind of the Christian community.
And it's not really, most, your average person, they don't have any idea. It's not their fault. This is like 2,000 years of swimming upstream. It's difficult. But I do think we are in a season, more and more people are interested in it. More important people, maybe they celebrate a Passover one time and they see all the elements in it, and that kind of excites them to make more sense of that. There does seem to be more of an interest in the Christian world, I think. I'm seeing numbers of sort of influencers who are celebrating Shabbat. That's kind of interesting to me. And so I think it's maybe not for everybody. Well, it definitely isn't. There's a lot of people that have absolutely no interest, but that's not my target audience. I've been quite successful, I guess, at the folks I've taken in as my students when I do my course on the 3 books, the Temple Revealed course. And, I don't necessarily have a lot of students, and usually by the end of the course, numbers have dropped out, but the ones that stick with it, they've been transformed and changed. And what more could a teacher ask for than seeing the transformation of one of your students and then looking at you and going, I get it, and thank you. Like, that's the highest compliment you could ever be paid. So I rest in that. If this is a thing I do, kind of 1 person, 2 people, 3 at a time, that's going to make more of a difference in a life and a legacy than going in and teaching, mass people where most of them are looking at their watch or on their phone when you're talking.
Well, I want to, because that's literally what the disciples did. They went to 1 or 2 people. They weren't holding, and I don't mean this to disparage Billy Graham or the legacy of Billy Graham, but they weren't holding stadiums of people to convert them to Christianity. They were just talking to the person saying, hey, let me restore you back to what Moses was talking about. Now, you mentioned your temple course, and I know you've done several now, and I've talked to some of your students who get it, but you came up with this workbook that you put together. Talk a little bit about that. So, because it ties the books together, and this is what you have to have for the course, right? Explain
Yeah.
your
So what I
course.
did was I looked for themes that were in all three books to try to tie everything together. And turned out they were the big themes. So I wrote a workbook companion that goes with the three books. And there's 12 chapters, and that covers 12 different topics, if you will. So we talk about things like the creation covenant, in the beginning, cosmic architecture, the structure of the earth for the ancients, the cosmic mountain, mountain scenery, mountain places of mountains where stuff happens, legendary all through the scriptures. I talk about the king's role. Um, Kings were associated as hunters and horticulturalists.
Right.
Talk about the Eden as sacred space. Also, rest and enthronement, another big theme. Waters of chaos is a big theme. And I finished the last chapters on new creation because that's where everything is headed. So those are big topics. Obviously, I usually spend about an hour and a half with each class and do the best I can. I can't go into everything, but I know full well if they understand these principles that when they start reading the scriptures, they're going to have their aha moments. Maybe a scripture they've read 20 times and they didn't even see all these elements in it. And then suddenly, there it is. So, and most of the information in each of the chapters does tie to the books themselves, but I do add information. One of the things is I did not see the whole combat myth, the divine warrior thing when I wrote the books. That came after. So
Right.
then I'm going, well, I'm really not interested in rewriting my books and adding that in. So we'll just add that into the workbook. And so I could tie that all together. And I'm thinking I probably will do a workbook of some kind for my latest book, the Greatest Exodus. I might do some sort of mini workbook and then maybe take some students through that as well. I've had people request that, so I'm looking at that.
Well, like I say, I mean, in my mind, not only are we friends and become friends, but I'm one of your students as well. And I think really where I really got a hold of what was in my head, nearly 20 years now, was when I started removing the religiosity of the story and just started making real life situation with real life people. And that helped me to understand the cultural reality of the various books in the Bible. And of course, then you open the door, and you and others to
Well, yeah, because
looking
I
at
got
what,
it from them.
yeah. Well, I remember going through Joe Good stuff about temple. And I was like, I mean, there's so much there that you can directly tie Jesus, Yeshua to,
Sure.
uh, or you can tie Adam to. So as I started looking at what the words meant thousands of years ago, and I'm going, the stuff that I'm learning in Sunday doesn't have any of this vocabulary in it, doesn't have any of this backdrop, it doesn't have any of this.
Right.
And so when you start going back and looking, oh my God, you mean to tell me Adam was the beginning of not humanity per se, but the story of Israel? and then you can tie it all together.
I think one of the biggest problems is, as you've mentioned, not putting it back in its cultural context.
Yeah.
And its cultural context is the ancient Near East world, and people really have a very hard time with that. It's like not a world they want to engage, but so much of the Bible functions within that world. So I do try to show people that. I've always had a fascination for that period in history. I'm not really sure why. I sort of remember, I think it was grade 11. I had this history professor teacher. I was in high school. And I learned all about Babylon and the ancient pantheon of Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar and all that stuff. And I was just absolutely fascinated. And all of the mythological stories, et cetera, et cetera. So it was kind of in my veins, even going back then. So it wasn't hard for me to make that transition. And I remember when I went back to school to finish my bachelor's degree, I went to the Assemblies of God in Southwest Assemblies of God University in Waxahachie. I went there to finish. And I had to write a paper on Babylon and some, the historical world, and it just got me excited and back into that whole somewhere in the mid 90s. I think I did that. So it wasn't hard to make that transition, but for others, like, this is so removed and so remote from their world. But my hope is, because all of any scholar worth his weight is giving you that ancient Near East history background. Like, all the scholars go there. There's not, I can't think of one that doesn't. The only ones that don't are the rabbis. So the ancient Near East world is not part of rabbinic tradition, which is unfortunate. But it is what it is. So we are very fortunate. We have some just tremendous scholarship now. Like, and unfortunately, Christians don't take advantage of it, and actually neither do Messianics. But it's fabulous stuff.
I agree. We've got just about 4 minutes left in the program. I got to meet an Orthodox rabbi who believed in Yeshua while I was in Israel, and that's like a light bulb that goes off. First of all, I never heard of an Orthodox rabbi who believed in the Messiah, the first coming. Well, he did. But anyway, in the last few minutes of the program, when is your book coming out? Give us the title of the book again, and when do you expect to have it printed?
Well, that is the $1 million question, right? But it's called The Greatest Exodus, and then subtitle A Divine Warrior Tradition. If all goes well, it should be out, I would say, maybe the second week of September. I mean, hopefully right before the holidays of the fall feasts. That would be ideal. So pray for ideal. Everything's kind of got to work. My editor's got to finish, and my formatter's got to finish, and my book designer has to finish, and it kind of all has to, work together.
Same book designer?
Yep. I'm using Robin Hanley.
Yeah, she does fantastic work.
Yeah, she's is wonderful. So I've given them all a heads up. Probably I've got enough to where Robin can probably start working on the cover. And Sarah, my editor, she's moving along as best she can. She's got a large family, so that's not easy. And then my formatter, he's ready and raring to go. So I think it's doable.
Good. Well, I mean, you're on the last chapter, you said, right?
Yeah. And this will probably take me about 2 weeks, I think, to write. It's not going to be as long as the other chapters, but I haven't quite figured out what I'm doing with it.
Well, before we go, I'm going to say to the audience, anybody listening, you guys, you got to find me on Substack. I'm moving everything over to Substack eventually, but I want to mention to you why Dinah Dye and I are real friends. Number one, she's very generous in spirit. She has a wealth of knowledge in her head. I've learned more from her about how to put all this together than anybody anywhere. But I've had a lot of academic people. I've read so many books, several of them. Dina, when you sent me Michael Morales' book for $120, I was like, give me a break. But that was a huge eye-opener, and that's one of my favorite books in the collection. The issue is, I'm a history person. I love history. I just want to write history or get the revisionist history out of the way so we can see the actual story. And Dinah Dye has helped me to do that on so many levels. I appreciate you so much for how much I have learned, but also you caused me to go back and look at that cultural integrity from which the writers were writing about. So much makes more sense to me, but the story continues to be more human than religious.
Yes.
And that to me is the gift you've given to me. So I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you. Like I said, it's the highest compliment a teacher can receive. Yes. So thank you, Jeff.
Well, we'll do this again because we're not going anywhere, hopefully.
No, apparently
folks, not. You can catch Dinah. If you go to her website, it's a pay site. I encourage you to invest in her website. It's called foundationsandtorah.com. If you want to go back to college or go back to school, just invest in that website and you will learn a lot of things. You'll also get an opportunity to see how Dinah has moved through the last 40 some odd years, learning and developing and being a part of sharing the story of the Gospels and certainly the Old Testament and the history of Israel. Thank you, Dr. Dye. Appreciate having you on, always. Is that it? Say goodbye, Dina.
Goodbye, Dina.
Goodbye, Jeff. Bye-bye, my friend. We'll be talking to you. Have a
All
great
right,
afternoon,
bye-bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.